we're going to go ahead and get started. My name's Tori Goebel, and I work with Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. On behalf of the whole Faithful Climate team, we're so glad that you're joining us for this webinar. We're excited to connect, and I'm really excited for everyone to hear from our speakers who are in Bonn, who have a lot to share. The title of our webinar is The Good, the Bad, the New, and You, the most important part. I'll take a minute and introduce you to the speakers you'll be hearing from. A brief, they can introduce themselves a little more. As you see on the screen, if you're on a computer, phone, from left to right, we have Kyle Myers-Scott from Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. Then we have Brian Webb from Climate Caretakers. In the back there, you can see Stefan. He's with Climate Witness Project. He will not be on the phone today, unfortunately, but Chris Van Eggen, who works with him, and he will be making sure that all of Stephen's updates get shared. And then we have Carrie Munven from Citizens for Public Justice. She was there the second week. They weren't trying to exclude her in a photo op. Before we begin, I want to point you to the chat function. This is a great way for you to be able to ask questions as speakers are talking as they come up. So if you're on your computer, if you look down, maybe you need to toggle your mouse, it might have gone away. You'll see a little bubble that says chat, and you can open that up and you have the option to send a chat to everyone. We'll all be able to see it, and the speakers will be able to see what you're asking and answer your questions at the end of the session. If you come up with questions after the fact, you can hold them till the end, and we will have time for question and answer, where you can just unmute yourself and we can have a conversation. If you're on your phone, it's going to look a little different. Just tap your screen lightly and you'll see a little bubble on the bottom that will say participants. It kind of looks like a message bubble, and when you open that up, you'll be able to ask questions in the chat feature that way. If you're calling in on your phone, you won't have that option, but just hold your questions until the end and just make sure to unmute yourself and you'll be able to ask your questions. So I'd like to pass it off to Chris to talk about our first topic, the good. Take it away, Chris.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, good. Somebody raise your hand or wave if my sound goes out. I'm on Mac's computer that I don't usually use, and I've been getting the spinning rainbow wheel popping up pretty frequently, but it seems to be working now. So yeah, like Tori said, I wasn't at the COP meetings, but it was exciting to follow along from here in the US, and I'm a close colleague with Stefan Lutz, who was there. Stefan works in Kenya for World Renew and grew up in Honduras, and his family lives back in Germany now, which is where his roots really are. So he's kind of a global citizen, and it was a real gift to have him as a part of our delegation. So the pieces that he wanted to share are pretty wide-ranging, but what binds them all together is the excitement that he saw of people from many backgrounds gathered around one common denominator, which was climate change mitigation and adaptation. As a person of faith himself, and as a person who invests heavily into community development, he was also enthused to see the amount of grassroots organizing that was coming to a head, so to speak, at COP23. One of our alliances that we participate with as World Renew is the ACT Alliance. They represent dozens of faith-based community development organizations. They had their own staff there and a team of other members like Stefan of faith-based organizations who were there able to be a part of the delegation. And that team did actions to gain attention from other participants and to gain media attention as well. They also participated in a lot of the dialogue, and that was one of Stefan's highlights too, as the first person to a COP meeting, was the effort to have open negotiations to community partners and civil society. So for someone like Stefan working in community development, the decisions made at CAP meetings and how those decisions are implemented, they're not only important for broad reasons of lowering carbon emissions, they're also important for reasons of how will the decisions be implemented on the ground in countries. And I think that's been one of the positives of this process from his perspective is World Renew and ACT Alliance being able to participate, to speak into those more sensitive issues of communities that are on the front lines of climate change, and to speak into those sensitive issues of communities who are already vulnerable because they don't have power in government that some of their neighboring communities do. So he thought that those were positive interactions, and the number of people represented through ACT Alliance and the Ecumenical Environmental Network was, I mean, the number of direct constituents represented through those networks was in the millions. So that was exciting to him as well. Another one of the new or good pieces, I guess this is the good, a little bit new, but we're focused on the good right now. Another one of the good pieces with that goal of hosting a high-level dialogue and having open communications is going to be shared by, let's see. You still hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, my thing cut out for a second. So Cindy was going to share some of another highlight from her perspective of the good too. So I'll let you share that, Cindy.
Chris, maybe you mean Carrie?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I misspoke. Thank you, Kyle. Carrie.
I've unmuted you, Carrie, so.
All right. Thanks, Kyle. The other piece that was highlighted for us, mostly from our partners, and I should say I'm Carrie from Citizens for Public Justice, and it's just around the breakthrough that was made on the agricultural negotiations. This is an area of climate negotiations that, as I understand it, have not progressed at all for a really long time. We heard stories of people who were in the negotiations, particularly from developing countries, who said that they felt like they could now retire because they got to a positive outcome after years and years and years of trying to move this agenda forward. And essentially what happened was that they kind of moved past the deadlock. Developed countries decided to step back and look at how they could work together. So they were able to put in place a process for how the agriculture discussions would move forward. But the big thing, of course, I'm not seeing it in my notes right now, was that they can now work on how to address the sort of the twin challenges of agricultural emissions and food security. So it's like they were stuck in the process mode, and now they've moved beyond that so that they're able to move forward from there. So that was a highlight that was brought to us from other faith-based colleagues, including Stephanie McDonald from the Canadian Food Grains Bank. Thank you.
All right, thanks. And one last word from Stefan. One of the faith messages that was powerful to him that he wanted to pass along was a message of, as we think about the challenges of climate change ourselves, it's such a huge issue, and as people of faith, how do we take action? A message that he heard that touched him was that we need to always start with looking to ourselves, looking where our own struggles are, really looking and seeing where we personally are being impacted by climate change, and the people who we know directly and love are personally being impacted by climate change. We can see those impacts ourselves, and the message was that it can even help us to be more in solidarity and steer us away from paternalism when we can start to see and come to grips with and give ourselves some compassion towards those places where we see the impacts of climate change, changes that are even impacting the land in ways that we love the land, or the weather in ways that we love the weather, and the environment in ways that we love the environment. When we see those impacts and start to recognize those impacts ourselves and not ignore them, but realize, hey, this impacts me actually. The way that I used to live and interact with the world might change. Starting there and seeing that and acknowledging that we're impacted ourselves, and sitting in that for a while, he said, can really help one to be able to take next steps to be in solidarity with those who are possibly more vulnerable and those who may be experiencing the impacts in a more direct way. So I want to pass that encouragement along from Stefan, our global citizen friend, as well to really pay attention to impacts as they touch us, sit in those, and let that be one of our many starting points and platforms as we look for encouragement in this work.
Thanks, Chris. That was a great overview of some of the highlights of COP23. This is Kyle Myers-Scott. I'm with Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, and I have the unfortunate task, perhaps, of sharing some of the lowlights of COP23, because it was not an unmitigated success. In fact, many impartial observers noted that it was a rather lackluster COP23, not particularly ambitious, but as Chris said, there were some important outcomes. So I'm just going to share a few of what we've kind of deemed the bad or the lowlights of COP23, and it starts with a couple of dubious firsts. This was the first COP meeting to take place after the Trump administration announced that the United States intended to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Many people wondered what effect that would have on COP23. I'm happy to say that the countries of the world appeared to be more motivated and more committed than ever to the Paris Agreement and to making the Paris Agreement work. As opposed to in times past, for instance, related to the Kyoto Protocol, when the US backed away from Kyoto and it essentially collapsed because other countries took that as permission to also walk away. We're seeing something different this time. We're seeing the United States, frankly, isolated among the countries of the world, which is good news. It's not being taken as an excuse for other countries to step away from the Paris Agreement, but countries are stepping up, they're working hard, they are figuring out how to implement the Paris Agreement and to move forward with the Paris Agreement, which is really good news. The second dubious first is that along with this, the United States made the decision not to have an official pavilion space at COP23. In COPs past and at COP23, the custom is for countries to host an official space in the convention center where they can highlight some of their technology, some of the creative ways that they are working to meet their climate mitigation goals. They can host speakers from their country, screen films, kind of show off a little bit. And for the first time, the US didn't have that space. And I think that sent a pretty clear signal to a lot of the countries around the world that the US is not particularly committed to this process under this administration. However, there is a movement in the United States right now called the We Are Still In movement, and it's a partnership between states and cities and businesses and college campuses to stand in the gap and to say, you know what, we actually are committed to the US's commitment under the Paris Agreement, and we're going to do everything we can to implement policies in our sphere of influence to try to help the United States achieve its commitment under the Paris Agreement. And in fact, all of those states, cities, businesses, and college campuses that are a part of that pact make up a full 50%, half of the United States economy. So that's not nothing. And it's good news that those non-state actors have stood up and to stand in the gap. And one way that they stood in the gap was at COP23. in the absence of an official U.S. pavilion, this group came together and hosted their own space. It was one of those really cool kind of inflatable igloo buildings, filled with really great side events and speakers. At any given time, you'd rub shoulders with a U.S. senator or a governor or a major business leader. And it was a really encouraging space to be in, personally, as a U.S. citizen during this difficult time right now, federally speaking. So the U.S. did not have an official presence, but the U.S. was there. They had a strong unofficial presence, and that sent a really strong message, I think, to the rest of the world. Another lowlight is during the official COP23, there are a lot of side events that happen. So the negotiations are happening all the time in one zone, and in another zone, there's all kinds of side events occurring, films being screened, lots and lots of activity. And the United States hosted one side event this year, and it was put on by some political appointees from the White House. And it was an event to promote the use of clean fossil fuel in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. So obviously that was met with some derision, and it was pretty disappointing to see the White House sending a group to promote that kind of a message, particularly at the first COP hosted by a Pacific Island nation. Carrie will talk more about that, but it kind of felt like a slap in the face to a lot of people. The U.S. had two official presences at this COP. They had the official negotiating team from the State Department, who were essentially career diplomats who were continuing the historic position of the United States in the negotiations. And then they had the politicals, people from the White House, and a lot of times those two groups were at odds. And this is one instance where those groups were pretty at odds. And so this side event happened on Monday night, Monday the 13th. It was the second Monday of COP23. But the good news here, if you're finding a theme, it's that there's a silver lining to a lot of these. The good news here is that the room in which it was held could host about 150 or so in the audience. The room was packed for the beginning of the event. And then a full 3/4 of the room stood up and staged a protest. In answer to David's question, this was the session that was that a walkout was staged. So about 3/4 of the room participated in a staged walkout, and they walked out. They hosted their own event outside of the room, where they chanted and they prayed and they spoke. You could hear them from inside the event room, so it really derailed the whole event. And the handful of people that were left in the room were mostly journalists, and it really kind of deflated the event. So it was great to see that kind of resistance to this kind of action, to have people stand up and say, we're not going to allow that to happen here. We've moved past that. And the United States politicals might be interested in continuing that conversation, but we're 20 years past that, and we can't be having that conversation anymore. A couple other lowlights real quickly are a little more nitty-gritty and specific to the negotiations, and I'll do my best to try to translate them with my own limited understanding, because I'll tell you, this whole process is like a totally different language. But one of the pieces of the negotiating process right now has to do with pre-2020 ambition, is what the shorthand for it is. Essentially, it's the notion that the framers of the Paris Agreement assume that it would take years for countries to move the Paris Agreement through their legislatures to get enough countries to ratify it in order for it to enter into force. So they made the assumption that it would take at least until 2020 to do that. So the Paris Agreement, actually, the mechanisms and the benchmarks for the Paris Agreement don't kick in until 2020. Everyone was pretty shocked, frankly, that it only took a year for it to enter into force in 2016. So the question then was, what do we do between 2016 and 2020 to make sure we're doing something while we essentially wait for the Paris Agreement to kick in? And that's the conversation around pre-2020 ambition. It's driven largely by vulnerable and developing countries. As you can understand and guess, they're the countries with the most vested interest in the most ambitious action as soon as possible. And developed countries and more wealthy countries expectedly kind of drag their feet in this conversation. And so it was hoped going into COP23 that there would be the creation of an official political space in the negotiations to talk about pre-2020 ambition. Right now, there isn't an official place on the agenda for this conversation to happen and to move forward. And that puts it at a real disadvantage in contrast to other pieces of the negotiating process like finance and adaptation. So it was hoped that there could be an official space carved out for that conversation to happen in the future. Developed and wealthier countries effectively blocked that move. And so that was a pretty disappointing outcome, that the conversation around pre-2020 ambition isn't really going anywhere still. The next step is in 2018 at the next COP. It's a process called the Talanoa Dialogue. Talanoa is a Fijian word that connotes empathy and reciprocity and dialogue. And it's a process that was baked in to the Paris Agreement, that in 2018, in preparation for 2020, countries would get together and would urge one another toward greater commitments that they as countries can make to the Paris Agreement before it kicks in 2020. And so that dialogue is really important now moving forward if we're going to increase the ambition going into 2020 when the Paris Agreement kicks in officially. So all eyes are kind of on that process at COP24. Real quickly, another piece that was pretty disappointing was loss and damage. Loss and damage is essentially the recognition that we haven't done enough to mitigate or adapt to climate change, and so impacts are happening that are irreversible. It's a way of accounting for the worst impacts that are happening to the most vulnerable. These are things like desertification in the Horn of Africa, sea level rise in low-lying Pacific islands in Bangladesh, things that can't be reversed, impacts that can't be reversed and have to be ameliorated. And so in the Paris Agreement, loss and damage was recognized as one of the three negotiating pillars, the other two being mitigation and adaptation. So there's a strong recognition that loss and damage is important, but so far it's really just been paid lip service, and there hasn't been a lot that's happened. In 2013, something called the Warsaw International Mechanism was founded for the purpose of better understanding loss and damage, of disseminating information about loss and damage, and most importantly, financing loss and damage efforts. So efforts to ameliorate some of the impacts of climate change in some of the most vulnerable places. The Warsaw International Mechanism has very little power right now. It was hoped that there would be a clear plan out of COP23 for loss and damage finance moving forward. That didn't happen. They got a very weak concession, which was essentially a commitment for a one-off expert dialogue to happen early next year in Bonn that will result in an expert paper that'll be delivered to COP24. So not very great as far as outcomes, but there were some larger symbolic wins around loss and damage at COP23. Because of the major storms that happened, particularly in the US last summer and in India and Pakistan, loss and damage was really high on the radar, especially at this COP because it was hosted by Fiji, a low-lying island nation. Loss and damage was really high on the agenda. It also made its way into a lot of the political leaders' speeches at COP23, reference to loss and damage. So it's never really been part of the ethos of the COP process before in the same way that it was at COP23. So that's really important momentum to continue into the coming years. The media is also getting better at picking up on loss and damage as a concept and about communicating it effectively. It resonates a lot with people who understand that climate change is impacting vulnerable people already, and that there's a fundamental equity question around how we're going to make that situation right. So the media is getting a lot better at talking about that too, which is really good. So new goals moving forward for loss and damage is to maintain that momentum, to make sure that the expert dialogue early next year is successful. So it wasn't all bad around loss and damage, but we certainly wanted to see more progress, particularly around finance, than we did. And finally, real quickly, I've been ragging on the U.S. and rightfully so, so far. But if you're Canadian on this call and you're feeling pretty smug, I want to bring you down a couple pegs. Canada is doing better than the U.S. certainly, but certainly not as well as it could and should be doing. One reason is it has pretty weak targets under the Paris Agreement. One example is its nationally determined commitment of a 30% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030 over 2005 levels. Given its size and its affluence, Canada can do a lot better than that, and should be doing a lot better than that. And that kind of gets to my next point, the disconnect between international rhetoric and domestic action. Canada is really good at saying the right things on the global stage, but when it comes to actually putting its money where its mouth is in domestic action, it could be going a lot farther, a lot faster than it is. And last, at these COPs, negotiations often take part in groups and coalitions. And there's one group called the Umbrella Group that involves the US, Australia, other really large developed countries, and Canada is still a part of that. So Canada has essentially hitched its negotiating wagon to groups like the US and Australia, who's pushing really hard for continued coal development in particular in its country, and really kind of finds itself caught between a rock and a hard place when this group makes moves in the negotiating process that don't align with Canada's rhetoric. And so again, that's a place where Canada, if it would break with that group, could really align its rhetoric with its action a lot better. Let me quick check the chats. Oh, okay, great. People are answering each other's questions. So that's all I have for this section. I'd love to turn it over to Carrie at this point to tell you a little bit about the new from COP23.
Thank you, Kyle. It's really great to have a chance now, a couple weeks after the end of COP, to sort of sit back and reflect a little bit on what was really a very intense process, I think, on all fronts, whether you were inside, outside, Bonn, Bula, whatever. But so I'm really grateful for this opportunity to talk tonight. Kyle's mentioned a couple of times the fact that Fiji held the presidency of COP23. And this is significant for a number of reasons. Most notably, though, it was the first time a small island state was it was hosted in Germany, but was officially presided over one of the COP processes. And this is something that provided an opportunity for them to actually present issues in a way that we didn't see before when COPs were held and hosted by more developed nations. As Kyle mentioned, it influenced the form that was promoted for dialogue in terms of a more collaborative, more conciliatory sort of approach to how we move forward with this. And it also created, I think, a really interesting platform for other not just small island states, but other developing nations to claim a little bit more of the rightful space in the discussion. So that was really interesting. It also brought an incredible energy and a real, the music, the cultural pieces that were brought in there were really quite spectacular, and I think brought a really fabulous flavor to the event, even though by most standards it was kind of wet and cold. But that was really good to see, and I think it's also significant because in the Talanoa dialogue that Kyle talked about, Fiji continues to play a role now in partnership with Poland, which I've heard some people describe as their government as being, right of the Genghis Khan. So not particularly progressive when it comes to climate action, but they need to now work together to move things forward. And Fiji continues to play a leadership role right up until the beginning of COP24. In terms of other things that are new, and I would argue that some of this falls both in the category of new and good. There were two key developments in terms of the rules and the guidance that's been given to the way that the Paris Agreement gets implemented. And the first of those is the Gender Action Plan, which not only recognizes that women internationally are disproportionately impacted by climate change. In many nations, they're the water carriers and the people that are out gathering, and they have to go longer distances to get water and that kind of thing. But the other thing is that women need to be part of the solutions. They need to be engaged at every level of the discussions and the action that's put forward to address climate change. And that's one area actually where, as frustrated as I can get with some of the issues that Kyle highlighted in terms of the gaps in Canadian policy consistency, say, when we were there and we saw not only our environment minister, our chief negotiator, most of their senior staff, all of the Canadian MPs that were present at COP23 were women. And that's an area that we know that our government has taken seriously in terms of women in leadership and certainly involved in this process. So that was really exciting to see. And that's something now that a framework has been put in place. It's by no means perfect, but it will help guide the implementation of the Paris Agreement going forward. And the second related piece is the adoption of the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform. And this is one, different reads of it have said it affirms the rights of Indigenous people, or it recognizes the importance of affirming the rights of Indigenous people and aims to support the full and equal role of Indigenous people in climate action. This one, I think, was somewhat challenging because not all nations see are at a spot where they respect and support the rights of Indigenous people. It is an area in Canada, of course, where our rhetoric has moved along quite nicely, but we still have a long way to go. But for the purposes of the Paris Agreement, there is now a framework in place that will need to be strengthened, but that does recognize the rights of Indigenous people. So that was a really positive outcome there. The next new thing that I wanted to speak to is the initiative that was led by the UK and Canada, which was the Powering Past Coal Alliance. And we talked a little bit earlier about the Clean Coal event that was hosted by the US. And what was really interesting was a day or two later, Canada and the UK hosted this Powering Past Coal event. And it was something that was really clearly done to draw a line in the sand and say, we're going to do this piece differently. And at the event already, there were, I think, 25 other nations and subnational governments who signed on to this alliance. It was something that our government was promoting as a really key outcome of Paris, or of Bonn, rather. And it was one of those things that, I mean, from my perspective, it was kind of fairly mixed. Neither the UK nor Canada came with new targets or timelines in terms of when and how the coal phase out would take place. But they were claiming leadership by inviting other countries to take action. And while that certainly is an important thing to do, it feels a little shallow when it's not backed up with further ambition and action on the part of Canada. So the caveat then there is, you'll see a couple of words with asterisks around them on the slide, is the announcement around a just transition. Almost as Minister McKenna was leaving Bonn, she met with a number of Labour representatives from Canada who were there to have a conversation about a just transition. And she has committed to developing a just transition task force. They will take the coal phase out, particularly in Alberta, as the test case for how mechanisms will be put in place, not just to support workers in the transition, sort of coal workers in the transition to a cleaner economy, but also those in their communities. So people who work in support services and other areas that aren't directly employed by the coal industry, but whose communities are very reliant on that industry now. So that's something that is continuing to move forward. I was in a meeting this morning, and there's some conversation now about the terms of reference and how that's going to be done. The hope is that it will establish a framework that will be applied in the first instance in the coal industry, but then applied more broadly as we continue to transition away from fossil fuels in Canada. The last piece that I wanted to speak to really briefly is something that I've termed a coalition of the willing. As has been said already, there was a really tremendous US NGO and subnational presence in Bonn. Pardon me. And one of the things that was quite interesting that emerged was an agreement between the governments, the federal governments of Canada and Mexico, with a number of US subnationals. They issued a North American Climate Leaders Statement and established a new North American Climate Leadership Dialogue. So this is closely related to the We're Still In initiative that has been mentioned already and that Brian will talk about a little bit more. But it was significant in as much as Canada is still negotiating in the same block as the US to look for allies who want to continue to move forward on climate action. So that was something that was really great to see. And they've committed to address a number of topics, including clean transportation, zero emission vehicles, efficiency, clean tech, clean power, carbon pricing, and short-lived climate pollutants. So there's a lot in there that will, I think, hopefully move forward because that's what we need. So I think those are the highlights I'm gonna leave there because I want to leave some time for questions and also for Brian to wrap things up.
Thanks, Carrie. Hey, everybody, this is Brian. Excited to be sharing with you guys. You may be wondering, what in the world do these COP processes have to do with me, or how does it relate to the work that we do on a daily basis? That's kind of where I'm hoping to tie our presentation up here with. The first one, Kyle stole a little bit of my thunder on the We Are Still In movement. But I really recommend, particularly those of you on the call from the United States, to check out the website, wearestillin.com. It's literally more than 2,000 entities. It's 9 US states, more than 100 US cities, and they're not all your typical usual suspects. You expect Seattle and Boulder and Boston to sign up. But Indianapolis, Houston, Atlanta, Little Rock, those are some of the cities signed up as well. The same thing for corporations. There's more than 1,000 businesses on there. Google, Facebook, Walmart, Nike, some of the largest and most innovative companies in the world are signed on to this, which is why when, as Kyle said, you actually add up the overall economies of all these entities together, and it counts for 50% of the US economy. It's actually only barely behind China for the #3 largest economy in the world when you look at that. So for me, as an American in Bonn, where I'm tempted to just apologize to everybody that I meet, it was highly encouraging to realize actually there's quite a significant amount of movement, positive momentum still happening. So the for you part is to be aware that this is happening, and I encourage you to check it out. Go to the website, look at the little dots, find out if your city, if your state, maybe your favorite company is signed on. There's also another section for colleges or universities. If you're connected to one of those, take a look at that and see if they're on. With my other hat on, I work at a small Christian liberal arts college up here in Western New York. I just sat down with my college president. I had a meeting with her for a different reason. And I said, hey, there's this thing We Are Still In that supports the Paris Agreement. 10 minutes later, she said, yeah, I'll sign on to it. And she signed on. So who knows, maybe you can get more people to sign on to that as well and increase the visibility of this effort. Number two thing to focus on, this is something to be on the lookout for coming soon. And this is something that I've been working on along with a handful of others called We Stand with Paris. It is not operational yet. You won't find a website yet. But coming in spring 2018, we are in the process of launching. And this also is in response to President Trump's announcement of withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. The We Are Still in movement has done a fantastic job of bringing together governors and CEOs and mayors. But if you're not a governor, a CEO, or a mayor, how can you take part in the Paris Agreement? For myself, I want to have an authentic way of engaging with the Paris Agreement for myself, since my government is not. And so this is what we're designing. It's going to be an online tool that doesn't just measure your carbon footprint, but does it in a way that's fun, that's engaging, that uses game theory to make it interesting, that uses social interactions to be able to challenge your friends, just like Fitbit does, for those of you who are familiar with how Fitbit works in challenging your friends to get more steps. The idea would be to challenge your friends to reduce their carbon footprint even further. Also, that aligns with the Paris Agreement goals and mechanisms in terms of increasing ambition, in terms of adaptation assistance for least developed countries, in terms of public reporting. All of that is sort of going to be captured in this mechanism. So this is just an FYI. Keep your eyes open for this. We're actually working with Arizona State University to design it. We've already got $20,000, and we're working to raise $150,000 to build it. And Arizona State University's philanthropy group is actually helping us raise the funds for it. So we're very excited about this. This will not be an exclusively faith-based effort. It will be non-sectarian, but certainly aligns with our broader goals within the faith movement. For those of you from Canada, we are looking to make this broader than just the United States as well. It'll start as a response to the United States, but we're hoping to make the online tool available for others to use, regardless of country context. Some things that you can do today. I'm a big fan of picking one thing a month and doing that one thing a month. This is getting down to the nitty-gritty practical here. And what I always tell people when they say, how can I make a difference? What does it matter? What can I actually do? I say, just pick one thing and do that this month. And the next month, pick a different thing and do that. And the next month, et cetera, et cetera. So for example, maybe this month you decide, I'm just going to turn my thermostat down 1 degree. It's a small difference, doesn't make a huge impact on its own, but compiled with lots of other people turning their thermostats down 1 degree, or compiled with 12 other things that you're going to do throughout the year, it adds up to make a really significant difference. Then in January, change 10 more light bulbs to LEDs in your house. In February, decide to carpool once a week, et cetera, et cetera. There are lots of little things that you can do. If you feel like you have to do them all at once, you'll never do them. But if you feel like you can give yourself permission to only do one thing this month, and that's it, and then you're off the hook, and then next month you do something different, over a while you'll realize that you've changed your entire lifestyle and you've done it at a sustainable pace. Second, because it's always more than just my actions, it has to be more than that. Always encouraging you to call, write, or email your congressperson or your member of parliament, just telling them this is important. I care about climate because I'm a Christian. That right there is already kind of busting some of their stereotypes, and that's important. We're not going to move past this politicized issue until we start to bust up some of those stereotypes, and our members of Congress, our members of Parliament start to hear that the people that they expect to be conservative, that they expect to be skeptical, are saying, no, this is important to me, and it's important because of my faith. So that's important to do. And then lastly, Carrie has something that she wants to share that she is working on. So Carrie.
All right, thanks so much, Brian. And this picks up on the last 2 points really closely. I want to tell you just briefly about Give It Up for the Earth. This is a campaign that Citizens for Public Justice launched for the first time this year through Lent. And the idea is, actually, if you can go to the next slide, Kyle, that by combining personal action and political action, we can work together to make a difference. It totally picks up on what Brian was saying in terms of saying that as a Christian, as a person of faith, climate change is important to me. I'm going to do more, and I want my government to do more. So through the period of Lent, which next year starts on February 14th and goes through to the end of March, we're inviting faith communities across Canada to organize local events, invite people to make their personal pledge. So something that you can do in your home, in your personal life to reduce your own personal emissions. The list that Ryan has there is a great place to start. And then the second thing is there's a postcard that we're inviting people to sign, and it's a call. It's written to Minister McKenna, and it's a call on the Canadian government to end all subsidies to the fossil fuel industry right away, which are still in the order of about $1.5 billion federal dollars every year. So there is the website there, cpj.ca/for-the-earth, or you can email me, Carrie, Karri, at cpj.ca to find out more, to get involved. But that's what we've got coming up next as a way to keep moving forward. Thanks.
Thanks so much for all of that wonderful information about ways we can get involved, and for all the speakers who put together these great presentations. I'd love to open it up to our participants to see what questions you have for any of the speakers or all of them.
Tori, I've got one thing.
Yes.
Yeah, so just one more thing to add on to give it up, not give it up, sorry, to the We're Still In campaign. They're adding a faith category on. If you've gone on the website during the webinar here, you will have seen that there are some churches and denominations who are already signed on to We're Still In. We've been in contact with them. They don't have the drop-down option for churches or denominations yet, but they're going to be getting it up in the next couple of weeks. So we think about how awesome that will be once that is up, to see churches and denominations on the We're Still In campaign. We, for the Climate Witness Project, and of course everyone free to join too, for the Climate Witness Project, we have over 70 congregations. We are really looking to have all 70 of those congregations on that list, so that when we look, we can see this is corporations, cities, states, and places of faith too.
Great. I will open it up again to any questions. You can either just cut in or raise your hand, and I'll try to call on you. We do have two screens, so I can bounce back and forth, but let's get some conversation going.
Just a reminder, if you do have a question, to unmute yourself on the bottom. Most of you are muted, so that's an easy mistake to make, is to ask a question while muted.
So does this mean we covered everything? We answered all the questions you ever had?
I think it's more that there's so many questions and there's so many cans of worms open. Which one do you open first? Yeah, I feel a little bit isolated because I'm in the north, in an industry-based town, and I have people here that still don't think climate change is even an issue. I'd like to know more about what Canada is or isn't doing. So maybe Carrie, you and I could have a meeting later on and just kind of see what we can do.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I was just I'm wondering about food and growing food and local food as a climate change mitigation strategy, and why that doesn't come up in our ways of our list of things to do. I mean, for us, we are 1,000 kilometers away from the closest major center, and our food comes from a long way away, and so most of the carbon dioxide that gets created is because of transportation of food for us. I just wonder if there's any talk about gardening and community gardens and local food production and promoting local food, as, you know, like stretching ourselves a little bit from LED lights to,
right,
you know, maybe there are other things that might be more acceptable to people, or anyway, I wanted to throw that out there.
My sense is that that is part of the conversation in terms of ways that individuals and households and churches can participate. I mean, I know one example here in Ottawa is right on Bank Street, one of our main downtown streets. Centertown United Church has an emergency food center, and as part of that, they have a garden, a beautiful garden, in some boxes that have been built on the sidewalk, and they've planted. And I mean, I saw it in the middle of October when stuff shouldn't really be growing anymore, but it was. And that's a part of something that they've done that not only is food related, but also addresses local social issues. But I mean, my sense is that in a lot of places, the local food movement is something that is gaining a lot of traction and is seen as a part of this. One of the things that we saw when we ran Give It Up for the Earth this year was that a number of the suggestions that we had were similar to what Brian has listed here today. They were saying, I'm already doing that. So that's a piece of it. I've just seen that David in Toronto has said that the flip side to the food discussion is not so much the growing, but the wastage. And that's true. I mean, if the emissions that we can create through the garbage is really huge. I know there are a couple of initiatives that we've seen are waste-free grocery stores and other, the zero waste movement and all of that. So I think that's an important piece of it for sure. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if we've thrown our contact information at the end of this, but you should have it through, I don't know if you were on our Faithful Climate Action mailing list, but actually I can even do this. If you want to be in touch, I'm just putting my email address in the chat box there. So,
Cindy, another thing to note is really the largest impact you can make GHG reduction-wise on food is actually what you choose to eat, and particularly whether you eat meat and what type of meat you eat. I'm not a vegetarian, but I've significantly decreased the amount of meat that I eat for that reason. Some groups estimate that beef production alone accounts for 17% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that's because of methane. I tend to think that's probably a little on the high side, but even if it's in the ballpark range, then that's a really significant number.
Yeah, I haven't heard too much about wild food, and we eat moose and deer and bear and fish. We don't eat beef. So when I take my ecological footprint test or quiz, I say, yes, I do eat meat, and then they bump me into this huge category when we actually eat very close to the land and with very little carbon dioxide being produced by these creatures that are out there anyway. So anyway, yeah, no, I agree. But the way we are meat eaters, but it's all food that we have gathered ourselves.
No, and you're right. Wild game is as far as I know, considered a carbon neutral solution. It doesn't impact your carbon footprint.
Yeah.
So a question from Rick that I want to make sure to get in here was, let me scroll up to it a second so I get it totally right. Do you have any stories from Bond where representing a faith community gave any of you an invitation or an in to a conversation that you might not have had otherwise? I have a quick story. One of the great moments for me in my time in Bond was participating at a sharing circle at the Fiji pavilion space with young people from Fiji. And I just kind of stumbled upon it. I sat down, I was just going to listen, and then really felt the Holy Spirit prompting me to deliver a message on behalf of YECA, on behalf of this community that's gathered here, to apologize on behalf of my country, particularly my faith and political community. I grew up in a conservative evangelical community, which historically has resisted action on climate change. And I was able to tell them there are lots of people like me in the US, in Canada, around the world, who are listening to you when you tell us that this is threatening your livelihoods and your cultures, and we're doing everything we can to try to stand in solidarity with you, to raise your voices, and to advocate for climate action. And as a result of that, there was a reporter who was participating in the sharing circle, and she grabbed me afterwards because she was really fascinated by that hook of an evangelical Christian at COP23 delivering this message that there are evangelical Christians who take this serious. And so I was able to do an interview with Brian with her. So that's one quick story of how being a faith leader and sharing our particular message probably created an opportunity that wouldn't have existed otherwise.
This is Ken in Grand Rapids. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yes.
My question is, has there been any discussion at COP23 about putting a global price on carbon?
Not that I'm aware of, though I haven't been as involved in the diplomatic meetings as some others, though I do know that Citizens Climate Lobby shows up to all of the COP meetings as one of the observer organizations that's there, and that they do have a pretty strong worldwide presence in other countries as well. But that's the extent of my knowledge on that.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think we're there yet. I think it's something that there are discussions that are continuing to develop regionally and nationally. I mean, we've got a couple of provinces that have had different forms of carbon pricing for some time, and now starting next year there will be a federal backstop, which means that in jurisdictions in Canada that don't have a price on carbon, that will be imposed. But I feel like that's something that needs to sort of germinate in a lot of different places before it kind of comes up to the international forum. But I don't know if any of the others want to add to that.
Yeah, I think you're right, Carrie, that it's the stage we're at right now, I think, is at the national level. And if it is part of the conversation, it's happening as part of each country's domestic conversation about how each of them are going to accomplish the commitments made in their nationally determined commitments to the Paris Agreement. So I haven't seen the carbon price conversation happen on the international level yet, but I do think that conversation is happening in a lot of countries at the national level. At least I hope so, as a potential mechanism to achieve their commitments.
The thing about the carbon price, I think the World Bank and IMF have both called for pricing carbon globally. And the attractive thing about it is that it really is a simple market solution to a market failure. The market fails to price carbon properly, and putting a price on it to correct that would still allow people to make their own choices about what they do, but it would probably shift their choices in a way that could lead to a real global solution or part of a solution to our climate action program.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Ken.
Yeah, I certainly agree too. Frankly, I don't see that happening anytime soon on the international level. The stage that these negotiations are at right now, I think that's a bridge too far for a while, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Do we have anything else before we wrap up? We probably have time for about one more question. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate you taking the time. The work did not end in COP, and it doesn't end tonight. So please stay in touch. If you're on our Faithful Climate Action email list, you will have gotten an email yesterday reminding you about this. And be sure to sign up for newsletters from the other organizations you may not be a part of to keep in touch about future events. Again, we're just so grateful that you took time to be on the phone tonight. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night.